Hello, y'all. I see we have 34 people here today. A lot of familiar names and not faces because I can't see y'all, but familiar names. Hi, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dipro. Today we're going to be doing a little boot camp about the upcoming API migration. So yeah, super excited to get started. We have 200 registrants, so I'll wait a little bit longer for maybe around 50, 60 people to join, and then we can start. In the meantime, I would love for you to drop in the chat just a little bit about yourself. I would love to know, introduce yourself with your name and introduce yourself with where you're calling in from. And make sure when you're sending the message that you're sending it to everyone and not just hosts and panelists. Otherwise, only me and Tom will be able to see it and no one else will. All right, Rotterdam from our friend Bas. Yeah, awesome. Nottingham, French TV channel. That's really cool. Cow Country, USA. Is that the name of the city you live in, Cody? Luis from Spain. Hello. Oh, amazing. Hi, John from Pennsylvania, which is nearby. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania as well. Argentina. A couple of folks from Argentina. A couple of Tel Avivs and Israel. Brazil. Nice. Okay. Thank you so much for putting in your where you're calling in from in the chat. I like to do that just to get a sense of who's in the room. As I said before, my name is Dipro. Let me do a quick intro. I always do a little weird intro. I'm Dipro. I am a developer advocate here at Monday. This is my face, as you can see. Developer advocate is a title that is used in a lot of different ways. The way I describe it is my job is to be the voice of the developer for our product team to make sure that your views are heard by our product team and brought into our roadmap, and vice versa. I'm the voice of the product team for our dev community, and that's what I'm doing today. I want to help you get a look at all of the changes that are coming up in our API. I want to basically run through all of them, and I want to get a sense of where y'all are coming from as well. So we're going to take some questions at the end if we have time, and of course, if you have any feedback as well, I really encourage you to put that in our community so we can have a longer discussion about it. But yeah, we're gonna go ahead and get started. So here's an agenda. Okay, I'm going to start with a high-level overview of the changes, why we're doing it, what's changing, kind of from the top level. We'll talk a little bit about timeline. So there are upcoming changes to our API. That's why we're all here. When are they going to be implemented? When is everything going to be stable? I'll then do some migration tips for different groups of people. So if you are an admin on an account that is using applications, what do you need to know versus if you're a developer? And then after that, we're going to go into the technical part and do a deep dive of every single API change that's happening. And I'll give you an example of how to adapt to it. Okay. This is a lot. And so I am going to start by saying we may not have time for questions. We have an hour today. But of course, if we do have even 5 minutes at the end, I'm going to try and review as many questions as I can. This is the QR code that will lead to a form for the questions. Yeah, so I'm going to flash this QR code on the screen a couple of times. So if you scan it now, great. If you don't worry about it. You'll be able to scan it later. I already have one question, which is, will this be recorded? And the answer is yes. So all good there. Cool. What time is it? It's 10:05. Okay, let's go ahead and get into it. Everyone should be here by now. All right, so let's start with the changes at a glance. Hold on. Can you see my blue slide? Because my display is kind of working out. Yes? Okay. Tom says it's fine. Cool. So then, yeah, if you only pay attention to one slide, it's this one, okay? End of the day, the next version of our API is going to contain some breaking changes. That's something you need to know. The support for the current way of doing things is going to end on January 15th, 2024. So that's when you need to update your apps by. I want to mention that each change inside of this version is relatively minor. They're mostly syntax and mechanism changes. We're not removing functionality. But these are affecting the most popular objects in our API. It affects literally how you retrieve items and columns from the API. And so what that means is the reach is really, really high. There's a very, very good chance that your apps will be affected by this. And so we're encouraging everyone to start a migration effort. And that's why we're here. I'm going to walk you through what that migration effort could look like for your application. All right. So lots and lots of changes, but why are we doing this? Okay, we're doing this because Monday as a platform is moving towards scale. Okay, we know that our customers really, really want to use Monday as a database. They want to use Monday to manage large amounts of data in a complex way with all of the flexibility that Monday offers. And until now, we've basically built a platform that can handle that scale, right? But we haven't been optimizing towards it. And we are moving into a direction where we really want to double down on giving customers that ability to build for scale. Okay. And so we have a new proprietary infrastructure called MondayDB, which some of you may have heard of, which is built in order to support this scale, right? So not only do we have a brand new backend, but we then also need an API to support that. And in our vision, it's not just about breaking some functionality in order to support this. We do want to offer a lot more new things in our API and new features that are going to make your lives a lot easier. And we have a vision for all of that. All right. And I see there's a couple of mentions in the chat. Go ahead and if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the form because we're going to talk about that in a bit. All right. Cool. So let's talk about new features and cool things. Okay, look, end of the day, we're going to focus a lot about breaking changes today, but I want to start by letting you know that there are some new features in this API that I think will make your life a lot easier, and I want to flag them because as you're making these changes, you might as well start adopting these. All right, so the first one is filtering and sorting. We have a totally new filtering layer on top of our API. In the past, you basically could only filter by an exact match of a column. So you could say, give me all the items that are marked as done. And that's the extent of the filtering. If you wanted to do anything more complex than that, you would have to get all of the data from the board, filter it yourself, and then present it to your users, which is a lot of hassle, right? So we have a new layer that lets you filter and also sort. It supports a lot of different things, including filtering by relative dates. So instead of just saying, hey, give me the 27th of August, you can tell them, give me all the items that have a date in the last month. You can also say, chain multiple filters together. So you can say, okay, give me all items that are marked as done or items that are assigned to me. You can chain all of that together with and or logic. And yeah, it offers a lot more flexibility. It basically gives you the same functionality that you have on the board in the UI, only as the API, which I think is really, really cool. All right. We also have some improved performance. Look, the main reason that we want to release MondayDB is to handle scale and improve performance. And so we are looking at a much faster API from like the second page onwards. Basically, in the past, when you're retrieving item 50 to 150, that was slower, and now it's kind of a consistent experience across the board. We also have a new API or a new way to query linked and mirrored data. This is really, really cool. And I think something that a lot of you will like. Basically, in the past, if you wanted to get an item that is linked from one board to another, you would have to query that column. You would get an item ID. You would have to then make another round trip in order to get the data from that item. Now you can do all of this in one single query. We have a syntax which lets you basically query the linked information as an item itself. And so you can do that to get a lot of kind of rich and complex information from one query. And that model also continues into columns. In the past, we basically bundled all of our column data into one really long JSON string. For those of you who are familiar with our API, you'll know that we basically just have this value object, which is a long string. You have to pull it out. You don't really know what's in it until you parse it out, and then you can basically access that data. Now we have objects that are specific for every column type. These objects are totally optional, but if you want to use them, you can use them to actually dig in and get more information. And I'll show you an example of that later today as well. So anyway, a lot of cool features. Unfortunately, we're not going to do a deep dive into filtering and sorting today, but that is something that I recommend you check out after this call, because yeah, there's a lot of stuff you can do with it. And chances are there's probably some functionality in your app that you are doing in order to filter in-app, and instead of that, you can just now rely on the API to do that. All right, let's do a quick time check. Okay, still got lots of time. Okay, breaking changes. At a high level, these are the breaking changes, and I'm going to go into each one in a little bit. So firstly, we have a new way of retrieving items from a board. Okay, so we have this items page object that basically represents a page of data from the board, and you need to use that every time you're retrieving items from a board or from a group of a board. This items page object not only is a new object inside of GraphQL, but also has a new way of paginating. In the past, we used offset pagination, which means you give the API the number of items you want and the page, which means which set of 50, let's say, you want from the board. Now, instead, you'll get a cursor that represents the next page. So you make these requests one page at a time, and you get that information back. The other thing is our API has this new way of getting columns and column values. And there are a couple of breaking changes there with regard to the create column mutation and how to get mirrored data, okay? Because as I said, we have a new mechanism for getting that mirrored information. Number 3, IDs are changing types. Now this is more of a inconsistency in our schema that we fixed. In the past, we'd have IDs like account ID that would be an integer in one field and a string in another field. And we've consolidated them to all use this ID type, which I'll go into in a little bit. And finally, we have a couple of bug fixes. I mean, if you look at the breaking changes and you look at the last 2 or 3, they're actually just bug fixes. They are things that were not possible before and would return a weird error and now return a useful error. So that's really good as well. Okay, and I'm not looking at the chat, but I am seeing this little red 3 on it. So I just want to say, if you have any questions in there, go ahead and scan this QR code and I'll put them in there. I'll try and answer them at the end of this call, and if not, then I'll post in the community with a response as well. Okay, let's talk about some key dates. On July 1st, that's when we announced this new version of our API called 2023-10. Okay, for those of you who are not familiar with the way that we're doing API versioning, every version is released roughly every 3 months. Okay, we're aiming for every quarter, but in this case, it's a little bit longer because there are so many breaking changes. And the version name is essentially the quarter. So 2023-07 is the version that is stable in July of 2023, right? The year and then the month. We always are going to release one version in the future for preview. And so on July 1st, this new version, which is 23-10, I'm going to call it, was available for preview. So you can access it today. I actually recommend, if you haven't accessed it, go ahead and play around with it. Even if you are not going to start the migration until maybe end of August or end of September, I would still really recommend you poke around with the new API just so you get a sense of what is changing. Okay, so this version is already available for preview. On October 1st, we're going to be marking it as stable, which means there won't be any new changes to it, and any change will be pushed to the future version. But instead of making it stable and also making it the default, we're actually going to be keeping the current version as the default in October. And the reason for that is we know that there's a lot of changes. we want to make sure that you have a little bit more time to prepare for that. And finally, the big day is January 15th. Okay, this is when the version will not be accessible anymore, the previous version, and the new version is going to be the default. Okay, so all of your migrations have to be done by January 15th. For those of you who have been following along, you may have seen January 1st as the previous date. We did postpone that. I think it was last week we postponed it, and we realized it's because January 1st is when most people are on break. And so if something happens and goes wrong, there's a little bit more risk of folks either having to get out of bed or just waiting until someone comes back from their holiday. And so we decided to move it to January 15th just to minimize that risk for all of you. Okay, and as I said before, you can use it now. Okay, so please go ahead and start testing it out. I'm recommending everyone migrate as soon as possible just to save yourself some headache in the future. You can test it out in a couple of ways. If you're making an HTTP request, you can actually use this header, API version equals, and then the version itself, which is 2023-10. I actually think I'm missing quotes here, but this is the header. And you can also use the little like clock icon in the API playground, and I'll show you what that looks like on our demo in a little bit. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about how to start the migration. Okay, I'm going to give you some to-dos according to me, according to the conversations that I've had with clients and with app developers in the last kind of month and a half or 2 months. Okay. And I want to give a heads up that this is not exhaustive. This is not exactly what you need to do, but I want to give you some ideas so at least you can start thinking about it. Okay. To get started, I recommend number one, logging warnings. Okay. So as of a few weeks ago, our API will now return warnings for whenever you're using a field that is about to be deprecated. And so go ahead and start logging these. Okay. These will be returned as an extensions object in the API response. And you can also update the SDK, and this will print the warnings in the console as well. And let me show you an example of that. So I'm going to move over to this screen, okay, and here. Tom, just to double check, you can see my screen still, right? You can see the API playground? Amazing. Okay, so let's use a query that is about to change, which is this items query. I'm not using items page. So if I hit run here, I'm going to get the data, and then right at the bottom, I'm also going to get this extensions object, which contains warnings. And this warning has the message saying replaced by boards items page in the next version. And so once you start logging these warnings, you'll get a roadmap of what are the API calls that are affected and where will you need to change your application, right? I want to say that this is not exhaustive. Not every single change has a warning, but the main ones, so items page, items by column values, these ones where the type is changing, these are, they're accompanied by warnings or they're logged, right? So you can start looking at those. All right. The other piece is review our materials. So today we already have quite a few materials that are available just to help you through the migration process. Okay, so of course we have this live stream, but we also have a migration guide in our documentation as well as release notes, which contain every single change and examples for every change. I'm going to show you those right now. Give me a second. I have to move some stuff around on my screen, but okay. So when you go into our API documentation, on the left-hand side, you'll see API versioning, and underneath it, you'll see release notes. This is a list of everything that's changing, both the breaking and non-breaking change. And if you click on each of these links, they will actually lead you to an explanation of each one. So let me give you an example, a good one. Here, why don't we just do the first one? So removed the deprecated items field and replaced it with items page. So what this does is it has a little explanation of what to do and how to update it. So each of these like changelog articles give you a brief overview of what's changing. And then on top of that, we also have this migration guide. When you click on this article right here, there's a very, very long and detailed article on how to migrate. Okay, so what's changing, the timeline of changes, as well as some common patterns and how to migrate them, right? So for example, if you're interested in how to use cursor pagination instead of offset, you can go to here, case one, queries that use pagination. And it explains not only how you would use it in the past, but also what you need to do now. And it also has a little implementation, which is useful if you are just looking to get a code snippet that you can copy paste and start using. All right, so those are our materials. Again, questions, go ahead and put them in. Let's scan the QR code and put them in here. I see there are some chats, yeah, I'm gonna look at those at the end when we go over the questions. Okay. So when we're talking about migration, what I thought about, how I thought about splitting it up is into changes that will actually affect the business logic of your app, things that require you to maybe look at a new variable before doing something, and also changes that are purely syntactical, which means there's a drop-in replacement for a query. You don't really have to change a lot of the actual logic of how your app works. You only have to change a query, okay? These are the changes that will affect business logic, right? And take this with a element of context of, depending on how your app works, it's gonna affect them more or less, okay? So the first one is cursor pagination. I'm gonna show you how this works, but basically now that we are using cursor pagination, the strategy for retrieving items from a board will need to change, right? Or maybe may need to change depending on what you're doing with the board. So if your app is retrieving all the items from a board in order to do some aggregation, in order to like show a view of all the items to the user, you'll need to adjust how you're actually retrieving these, because in the past, I've heard of customers basically trying to get all of the items in parallel API calls. You won't be able to do that anymore. You'll need to make an API call, get the cursor, and then keep doing it over and over again. With cursor pagination, we also have added a limit on the number of items you can get from a board. This is a pretty reasonable limit. It's 500. Technically, right now it's 100. We're changing it to 500 in the next few weeks, but it will be 500. And basically, the reason for that is we saw folks were trying to retrieve 10,000 items from a single board, and those queries would time out. And so now we're setting a reasonable limit to make sure that those queries don't time out and that our system prevents you from running into that problem. Okay, the other one is retrieving connected data. So again, I'm going to show you each of these later, but when you're retrieving connected values such as the mirror, the connect boards or board relation value, and then also dependency, these are some extra work for our system, right? What we need to do is we need to take the item, and then we also need to take the connected item and display it to the user, or display it to the client of the API. This is logic or an action that we don't want to do unless the user explicitly requires it. And the reason is we want to ensure that our platform is working smoothly for everyone. And so you'll need to explicitly use the mirror value or board relation value objects in order to get this information. I'll show you the query later. It's very simple. It looks exactly the same. You can actually get the data the exact same way as well. There's no change in the response, but you will have to use this every time you are expecting a mirror column to be returned, a board relation column, or a dependency column. Okay, let's talk a little bit about storage and types as well. Okay, so we are changing the way that we're returning IDs. Now we're more consistently returning everything as a string, which means that if you're storing this as in your database as an integer, you'll need to migrate that. Okay, I have a list of all the IDs that are changing, which I'll post after this this webinar. And so you'll be able to see what's updating, and you can then cross-reference that with your database. But yeah, I'll show you what this looks like as well in a little bit. Filtering. I mentioned this before. We have a lot of new board level filters. If your app does any kind of data filtering, so that means filtering on dates, filtering on column values, filtering on statuses, go ahead and just check if you can use our board level filters, because that'll save you a lot of work. It'll save you having to maintain that filter logic. And chances are we'll also add some extra functionality to that as things move forward. And then finally, the create column mutation. If you're creating columns, we have this enum value that we added to create some more consistency. Again, I'll show you that in a little bit. And what that means is you'll need to ensure that you're using these enums when you are creating these columns. Okay, so those are the technical pieces. Now I want to break it down by groups. Okay, so if you are an external app developer, and I know that there's a lot of you here on this call, because this is not changing the functionality of the API, i.e., we're not removing any API calls. I recommend that you try and aim for no workflow changes for your customers. Okay, I'm sure there are a few of you that have complex apps that will require a small adjustment, but from our assessment, it seems like most folks should be able to make this change silently without customers having any interruption to their day-to-day. If you do find that actually there are some updates that are required for your customers, notify them early, right? This is something that we want to make sure that our customers know about, or our shared customers know about, and can keep an eye on, right? So let's say they have to change the way that they maybe change the columns that are supported in their boards, then they'll need to be able to make those changes before January 15th as well. And of course, start migration ASAP, okay? You can start building this right now, and then you can turn it on once the API is stable on October 1st. I can say, looking at the roadmap, that we're not planning any major changes before October 1st, but there are small things that are updating. For example, that limit thing that I mentioned earlier, where the limit for items is increasing from 100 to 500. So what that means is go ahead and start building right now, and just do a check-in on our changelog to see if there's any new updates before pushing after October. And one last little note is that, like the logical changes thing I said before, pagination is going to affect apps that get large amounts of data. So just keep that in mind when you are thinking about the workflow changes for your customers. Okay, so that's external apps. Now let's talk a little bit about admins and account owners. From the chat earlier, I think I saw that there are some admins in this group. I want to just walk you through what needs to happen so that your account can be working as you want it to, okay? So firstly, you want to do is review the applications that you're using. And for certain applications, contact the developer if you need to, okay? For internally built apps, right? So these are apps that either your own development team built or a service partner built. These will need to be updated, right? These are essentially apps where you or your team are the developer. And so all of the things that are on the left apply to you, okay? For marketplace applications, so if you're using an app that you installed from our marketplace, the developer will be making these changes. And so keep an eye out for communication from them if there are updates required. But as I said before, based on the changes, the majority of apps will not have any workflow changes. Things should just be updated in the backend without you needing to change anything on your side. And then finally, no code integrations. I know a lot of admins, sorry, are using custom API calls through third-party integration partners, such as Zapier, such as Make, such as Workato. These are essentially external platforms that have built connectors using our API to fulfill these integrations. And so I would double check with the platform, like reach out to Workato, reach out to Make to understand if any changes are going to be happening. In most cases, if you're using the inbuilt connectors, there will probably not be any changes except for maybe the connectors that require pagination. But if you are making any custom API calls with these integrations, so a lot of these integration platforms allow you to just make an arbitrary HTTP request to an API, these will need to be updated, right? So if you are making those API calls from, let's say, Zapier or Make, you'll need to go in and double check those. But if you're using the regular inbuilt connectors, I would rely on the developer of the integration to make the changes and then reach out to you. And then finally, internal app developers. I think there are folks here who are essentially internal app developers who don't use Monday on a day-to-day basis or don't develop from Monday on a day-to-day basis. And have been pulled in order to like assist in this migration effort. For y'all, I want to say a couple of things. Firstly, Monday is being used by folks pretty regularly. A lot of our teams basically rely on Monday for their day-to-day work. And so make sure that whoever is the end user of the workflow or the application knows that you are making changes, because I've seen in the past developers trying to make changes in secret, basically, and then something happens and maybe nothing breaks, but like a slight logic changes, and then the business side says, hey, what's going on? Why are my statuses yellow instead of green? I need to know, right? So make sure you're being very transparent with the team. Number two, there's a lot of ways that you can do development and testing with the duplicate workflows. So we have a couple of ways that you can duplicate the entire board and then have that like essentially like carbon copy to develop on. Okay, so go ahead and play around with that. I think it's going to be really, really useful. So you're not actually testing inside of someone's live workflow. And finally, if you do need a sandbox, you can sign up for a developer account. There are a couple of ways to do that. The main way is just go to our documentation, and in the, there's like a get help article, there's a link that says sign up for a developer account. Go ahead and click that, sign up, and use that for all of your testing if you don't want to use the main account for that. So for those of you who are not so familiar with Monday, these are the tips that I have for you. And yeah, so these are all of the migration kind of examples and heads ups that I want to give you. It's now 10:30 and I have 9 code examples to get through. So we're going to do that pretty quick, and hopefully we have some time for questions. Let me do a quick recap of the chat and see. Okay, there's a couple of questions in here. Again, I'm gonna review these at the end, but use the QR code and the form link that is in the Q&A to submit those questions, and I'll take a look after this. All right, so the first example that I want to show is the items page object, okay? And I want to show you the object and cursor pagination. So let me do this slide thing and open up the playground. Okay, so right here, I have this API call, which returns items from a board, okay? I have this board ID, and I have the items object, and I'm sending these arguments limit and page. And this works today, but if I go to the new version, and this is how you change the version, I see items doesn't exist on board. And the reason is I need to use the items page object in order to paginate through the items, okay? And so the way to solve this is in between boards and items, I need to add this new items page object. So I can just write items page, and let me just add some curly brackets so that the nesting works. And then after this, now I need to start paginating. And I do that pagination not on the items object, but on the items page object. And so this limit and page parameter or argument, I'm going to delete that and shift it up to the items page. Okay, so items page takes this limit parameter, and I'm going to put limit, I think it was 4 before, so I'll do 4. Actually, let me do 1, just so that we only get one item back. And when I hit run, what this is going to do is it's going to give me 1 item from this board. And the reason the items page object is interesting is because not only does it take the limit, it also takes the cursor. So, I didn't add cursor to this. Let me add the cursor field to the items page object. And so what this is going to do is give me a string that represents the next page, okay? So if I copy this, I can then pass this to items page again as a string. So you can see I still have the same limit and I have the cursor. And what this is going to do is it's going to give me 1 item after the cursor. And when I do that, I get another cursor, and I can pass that in here, and so on and so forth. Now, what happens when you get to the end of the board? Well, you won't get a cursor anymore. So let me change the limit to 100, and this will give me 100 items after this cursor. I know for a fact this board doesn't have 100 items, so I will basically get the end of the board. And you'll see that the cursor returns as null. Okay, so that's how you know that there are no more items and you don't have to keep paginating. From a like application logic perspective, what you need to do basically is make that first API call, store the cursor, pass the cursor to the next API call, and if the cursor returns null, then stop looping through and continue with your application, or continue with your with whatever behavior you have. So yeah, so that's how to use items page. I know I said I wouldn't cover this, but I do want to quickly show you the filtering. So this items page object has this query params object, which actually contains a lot of different things, including sorting, but also filtering. And so what you could do is you can pass a number of rules to this parameter, and the rules can have things like the column ID and the compare value, which is basically what you want to compare. And then what you can also do is pass, in addition to the rules, pass a order by, so you can sort. And this also accepts subsort, so you can say order by column ID status, and then direction, ascending. Then when I hit run, it'll give me that information. And I don't get anything because there's nothing that's marked as done. Okay, so I don't get anything. But I wanted to show you the syntax of how you can start building out these filtering logics, and I think it's really, really cool and very useful for those of you who are just kind of maintaining this in your app. Anyway, all right, so that's items page. Let's see, what's next? Deprecating items by column values. Okay, for those of you who are familiar with our API, you know that we have this query called items by column values. And what this does is it lets you get items by their column values. So it's a search, right? That returns items based on an exact match. And we have two of these. We have items by column values and we have items by multiple column values. Hold on, multiple column values. And both of these queries are being deprecated and are being replaced by the items page logic. Okay, so instead of items by column values, it's items page by column values. And we're also combining both of these into one query so that you don't have one for a single value and then one for multiple. And so the new query is, hold on, let me just run this first. Yeah, see, you'll get this deprecated error. And then the new one is items page by column value. So what you'll need to do is change the name of that query. What this takes is a board ID, but it also takes a columns argument. Okay, and so this columns argument is an array of exactly the data that was there before. Okay, but in object form. So I can basically just copy this in here and put it there. Maybe not. Hold on. Let's look at the documentation. Items page by column value. Okay, so I need columns, and then in the columns, column ID and column values. Oh, so what's missing is that I actually don't need this array. Columns. There we go. Status. This is an array. So now we'll put that as done. So basically what I did is, let me close this. Hold on. Let me copy this down here. And we'll go back to what it was before, okay? So I can show you what exactly changed, okay? So in the past, I had, okay. So I had this column value field, I had column ID, and what I did was I changed it to column ID is the same, and then column values now has an array, and it's called column values instead of column value. Okay, so that's what changed. And essentially, this is the part where I said it was a syntax change, right? It's the new version has a drop-in replacement. This is something you can do without changing any logic in your app. All you need to do is change the actual query itself and how you're making that call, and then everything else will work as usual. One thing that I forgot to add actually is that this returns a page, and so I was actually so stuck on filling out the arguments that I forgot to show you how to actually get items from this items page. So items page will return a page of items. And so what you'll need to do is actually return items from here. And this is all very confusing because I was on the old version and now I'm on the new version and I get the correct lines and stuff. So if I want to get the ID from each item, I can do that. If I want to get the name, I can do that. Yeah. All right. So I got a little bit kind of confused here, but bottom line, this is the new version of items by column values. It returns a page, which means that you need to then retrieve items from that as well, but the arguments remain the same. All right. IDs are also changing type. All right, so let's talk a little bit about that. So in the past, we had a really weird situation where you could get a board ID and it would look like this. It would be a number and it would be in string form. And then you'd get an account ID and it would also be a number. And on our side, it would be generated in the exact same way. It would be a unique number, a unique ID, but it would be an integer. Okay, so these basically represent the same thing, which is some unique ID, but they're being returned in different ways. And they have different types in our GraphQL schema. What we've done is we've actually updated this so that each of these fields actually has one type. It's called the ID type. And this ID type is special for a couple of ways. Okay, the main thing you need to know is that it actually returns the string. So this is the old version of the API. This is the old version of the API. When I run it, it gives me an integer. And then when I move to the new version, it's a string. Okay, so when you're actually getting the information, you need to make sure that it's a string. But the good thing about the ID type is it's dynamic, okay, which means that when you're using it as an argument, you can actually send either an integer or a string. So when you're actually using these IDs as arguments, you don't have to change anything. If you pass a string today, you can continue to pass a string. If you send an ID today, you can continue to send an ID. And I'll just show you an example of that, okay? Here I'm getting boards, and let's say I want to get this board, okay? Let me send it as a string, and what I'll do is it'll be successful. I'll get it as a string back. But if I send it as an integer, since this is an ID type, I'll still get the same thing. It's still a valid query. And so for queries, or when you're using this data as an argument or as an input, you don't have to worry about it. But when you are using this information as an output, you need to make sure you're saving this as a string because it'll be retrieved as a string. Okay. Oh, one more thing is I have a list of all of the IDs that are changing, and I have that in the release notes. So let's open up release notes. Sorry, I'm having some Zoom issues. Okay. So here in the release notes, there is a section for many of the ID arguments have changed from integer to ID type. When you click here, you'll see a table that has every single ID that is changing. So you can just keep an eye out for that, okay? We also have a list of impacted arguments, but as I said before, it doesn't really affect your application logic. The main thing is when the fields are changing from integer to ID, okay? So this is a list of everything you need to see, so go ahead and check that out after this call. All right, I'm actually going slower than I need to in order to finish in an hour, so we're gonna go a little bit faster. Okay, we're gonna pick up the pace. Typed column values, okay? I want to talk a little bit about typed column values. So in the past, column values would return here. Let me comment this out and let me show you what they would return. They would return this value field that was a long JSON string, okay? And if I go to the old version and I run this, I get this kind of ugly JSON string. It's not consistent about what's going to be inside that string. I need to do an extra step of destringifying it in order to get the data inside of it. It's not very fun to work with. And so what we have now is every single column has a type and has a value, which contains all of these fields broken out. For example, if I go to, let me change to the new version and I go to status value, you'll see that it includes all of it's a superset of column values. So it includes the column, the ID, the type, but it also includes all of this other data that is specific to statuses, right? So it includes the index, it includes is done, it includes information about the label, and so on and so forth, okay? And the way to access this information is to use a GraphQL fragment, okay? So you use this syntax here, use a ... and then you say on status value, return this. And what this tells GraphQL is if you have a status value that is being returned, return this additional information. And if you don't, then just return ID and text. And so when I hit run here, I'll get working on it and the status, but then for the status, I'll also get the label style, specifically the color of the label. And then for the items that are not statuses, I just get ID and text. So this is a great way for you to ask for more information if you need it, and break down that kind of value field without doing a lot of extra steps. Now, this is a simple example, which basically requires you to know that you're getting a status back, right? And then if you know that you're getting a status back, then you want to show this information. What if you're not sure and you want to create different logic for different kinds of fields? Well, that's where a bigger fragment comes in. What you can do is create a fragment that contains multiple different types, right? So I have a status value for status column, date value for date column, tags value for tag column, people value for people column. And I can mention that with this ... syntax in column values. And what I'll get is essentially the ID and type for these, for any other column value. And I will get all of this data if I do have these columns on my board. And so when I hit run, I will actually get, oh, this board has almost all of them. So yeah, so I get the status information. For the date, I of course don't get the label and the label style, but I get the date and time instead. For tags, I get tag ID and so on and so forth. So you can use this fragment and this pattern to essentially create fallbacks, right? So if you, let's say, are not sure what kind of data you want to get back, or what data you are going to get back, you have all of these fallbacks. So if you get a status, then you are retrieving the right information without you having to make a second API call. All right. On that note, since we're talking about columns, I also want to show you the create column mutation and what is changing, okay? So in the past, in the previous version of the API, there were a couple of things, okay? First, create column, which creates a column on a board, would not require the column type as an argument. This was a bug, okay? Because if you tried running this with no column type, you would get a 500 error. And yeah, see, I get a 500 error. So this was a bug. And so what we've done is we've made column type required, okay? Another thing about the previous version is that this column type was a string. And actually this string was not consistent with what column type you would get returned by the API. So if you queried a column, if you queried a checkbox column, for example, you would get the string checkbox. But if you wanted to create a checkbox column, you would have to use the string Boolean, which is inconsistent. It caused a lot of problems for our developers and drove people up the wall. And so what we've done is we've actually taken all of these column types and made them consistent using an enum, which is basically like a list of values that it could be. And we've made that column type accepted by the create column mutation. So in this case, like status. Okay, my computer is slowing down a little bit, but let's see if this works. There we go. Okay, so status, for example, new version, and then it would create a status column. Okay. Now this is important for you to know because these enums, because of the previous discrepancy or inconsistent behavior, these enums are not always going to match the column type that was used before. And so you need to review what column types you're using and make sure that you're using the correct version in the new API. I actually yesterday created basically just a table with all of these column types, and I'll share it with you after this call in our follow-up, so that you can see every single column type, what's available in the old API, what's available in the new API, and so you know what needs to be updated. So I'll share that with you after this call. All right. Now column type enum, we covered that already. Returning linked column data. This is also something that is related to column, okay? So let's go to the fragment that we had before, or actually I have something here. Okay. So let's take this query, okay? This is a query that returns column values, and it returns column values, the data from the column values with no concern for what kind of information you're getting back, right? This is a very popular approach because it means you get all the data regardless of what it is, and you don't really need to care, right? The challenge with this approach from our side is if you're retrieving data that is hard to get, for example, mirrored data, connected data, anything that requires us to go to one board or 3 boards in order to like get that information, it's challenging. It's a performance issue on our side. And so what we've done is we've said, if you are getting any of these kinds of data that are special, right? So specifically the board relation, which means connect items, the mirror value, and the dependency value. If you're getting any of these 3, we're not going to give them to you if you just query them like this. If you query them kind of quote unquote blindly without specifying that you want this, right? So this query will actually return blank for this text field. And so what you need to do in order to fix that is, if you are expecting to get mirrored data, is you need to use a fragment, okay? So if you're using this fragment, then the text value will come. If you're using the fragment for mirror value, the text value will also come. I run this. If I've set this up correctly, yeah, there we go. So this connect boards column is of type board relation value. And so I'm getting item 1, item 2, item 3. And in the next version of the API, basically like this will return blank if you're not using this specific object. All right. I told you we have a lot to cover and we have 5 minutes left. So I want to see how much more we have. Okay, we have 2 more. They're pretty simple. One is a bug fix. So the GraphQL spec says if you have empty parentheses, this is illegal and should not be allowed. Our previous version of our API allowed it. And so we are making this more consistent by saying, okay, we're going to follow the spec and we're going to make this illegal. So if you try and use empty parentheses, you will get an error message. And then the next one is strings must be quoted. Okay, this is actually something you saw. I don't know if you noticed when I was using the create column object. The create column mutation, sorry, would receive a string for column type, but would accept strings that don't have quotes around them, and it would basically treat it as an enum. This is bad, and so we've stopped this practice. And so what that means is, if you are taking advantage of this, you need to just adjust your code. All right. So those are all of the examples that I wanted to show you. This wraps up the meat of my presentation.